All right, we're going live on YouTube.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to call our hearing to order again. Thanks again for being here today. My name is Jay Griffin. I'm the chair of the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission. Joined in attendance here at our virtual hearing, Commissioner Jennifer Potter, Commissioner Leo Asuncion. It's a hearing for Public Utilities Commission docket number 2018-0088 related to the Commission's investigative proceeding to investigate performance-based regulation, or PBR. Also joined by our staff here today, Chief Counsel Caroline Ishida, Commission Counsel Mark Kayatsu, Chief of Policy and Research Dave Parsons, Commission Economist Daniel Park will be running the Webex this morning, and as well as some of our IT staff, David Takashima, Elsie Lee. As noted yesterday, the Commission is recording this hearing. The Commission will make the recording available to the parties via letter notice in the docket shortly following the conclusion. The Commission is also live streaming this on the YouTube channel. The Commission reiterates our strong preference is not to close from the public any portion of the hearing. Parties are strongly advised to avoid referring to confidential information to the greatest extent possible. In reference to our last section today will be the closing remarks from the parties that have requested. Each party shall have at least 10 minutes to provide closing remarks, with the exception of Hawaiian Electric, the Consumer Advocate, Blue Planet, and Ulupono, who have all requested an additional 10 minutes for their closing remarks for the total of 20. Slight change today. We will provide warnings at the 5-minute and the 1-minute mark, but we will provide them via the chat function. This is to help avoid interrupting your flow as you're going through the closing remarks. So please monitor either someone from your team or yourself the chat function, and we'll type in there at 5 minutes and 1 minute, and then I'll notify you when time is up. Hopefully that's clear enough to everyone. Great. With that, we will begin with the closing remarks, and I will turn it over to Hawaiian Electric, Mr. Aoki, Mr. Williams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Potter, and Commissioner Asuncion. We would like to begin simply by adding our thanks to the Commission staff, the parties, consultants, and everyone who participated in this process since this proceeding was first instituted in April of 2018, for the significant dedication of time and resources by everyone, and particularly the Commission. Through that early phase 1 process, the review of staff reports and technical conferences, we began to discuss the guiding principles for performance-based rate making, as well as each such prioritized outcomes as DER asset effectiveness, interconnection experience, customer engagement, GHG reduction, CBRE, electrification of transportation, and resilience. Through 2018, we submitted briefs on goals and outcomes, metrics, and regulatory assessment, which included the company's discussion of transformational efforts, such as an RPS achievement or carbon intensity outcome, which could include positive incentives to exceed RPS targets in a cost-effective manner. In May of 2019, we received the Commission's decision and order number 36326, which established the regulatory principles, goals, and outcomes to guide phase 2 and identified a portfolio of specific PBR mechanisms for prioritized examination and development. As a part of the phase 2 process, we all participated in 7 sets of RWG and PWG meetings, workshops, which included party presentations of their proposals, and subgroup meetings. As discussed in our presentation on Monday, the companies did take seriously the Commission's guidance that, quote, this iterative process is intended to ensure that the parties explore, test, and improve their respective proposals prior to their final submission to the Commission. Through the Commission's process, and particularly through the Commission's facilitated workshops with RMI, which I like to affectionately refer to as the post-it process, the companies were able to discuss and evaluate the proposals of other parties. This included the detailed proposals by Ulupono Initiative, which are some of the most developed. As noted on Monday, in response both to this process and the Commission's guidance, the companies evolved their proposals, particularly for PIMs and shared savings mechanisms, as reflected in the company's first and second comprehensive proposal updates and statement of position. This has all resulted in a comprehensive PIM portfolio submitted for the Commission's consideration. With regard to PIMs and SSMs, the companies recognize that the Commission will select a portfolio that best works together to incentivize prioritized outcomes within a particular award range and avoids unnecessary duplication. As we discussed on Monday, of the proposals in this proceeding, the companies would respectfully recommend that the Commission select Ulupono's RPSA, EOT, and shared savings proposals, and the company's proposed cost control shared savings mechanism. Mechanisms which together will promote renewable resources, both large and small, reduce emissions, engage customers, and mitigate costs, including for MPIR projects, with total incentives in the range of 150 to 200 basis points of ROE, and for this initial selection, the scorecards and reported metrics proposed by the companies, or some subset thereof. Simply stated, the companies submit that this set of performance mechanisms, as designed, represents a portfolio responsive to the Commission's direction and guidance, one which is complete, within the company's ability to achieve, which is critical, and can be implemented and administered upon the Commission's Phase 2 decision and order in this proceeding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and I will now yield to Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Aoki. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Commission staff, and consultants, parties, and members of the public who may be tuning in via YouTube. Again, I am Thomas Williams, and I'll be making the MRP closing on behalf of the three Hawaiian Electric companies. With respect to MRP, the goal should be to improve what we have today. If the X factor is not negative, that means improvements will have to be accomplished elsewhere. Clarifying and reasonably expanding the scope of PIR will help. Removing lag will help, depending on the price we have to pay for that. A symmetrical ESM will help. On the other hand, a much larger consumer dividend, as suggested by the consumer advocate Ulupono and County of Hawaii, will hurt. We will start our PBR journey in a hole that will be challenging to dig out of. That could threaten the momentum the companies have on transformational efforts and would not help sustain that momentum. That's not the win-win solution we are all seeking. With respect to bill impact, we said we would provide the bill impact information that is already provided in our scenario submissions, and we will. But I want to give you a preview of that. For scenario 5B, the compound, that's the one with the rate increases, the rate cases, the compound annual growth rate, or CAGR, for the consolidated bill impact from 2021 to 2027 is 1.6%. For scenario 5C, without the 2025 rate case increases, the CAGR is 1.1%. That's on a consolidated basis. This is well below the assumed inflation rate of 2% that was used in the analyses. In real terms, bill impacts go down. The CAGR in 5B is higher because it assumes rate increases in 2025. But we are not asking for approval in this case for 2025 rate case rate increases. So it's scenario 5C that you have to look at. Any future rate increases will have to be fully justified by us, reviewed by the consumer advocate, and approved by the Commission. We do not presume to know the future, but we are compelled to plan for uncertain alternative futures. Our actions will help shape those futures. If the Commission approves our MRP proposal, we will do all we can to capture additional efficiencies and avoid the need for those rate cases. We recognize there is an opportunity to earn incentives, depending on the design of the PIMs, which would impact the CAGR. But as Ulupono says, those incentives are intended to accelerate renewable energy growth, which has the potential to more than offset the cost of the incentives. And we have supported a number of the Ulupono PIM proposals. With regard to the X factor, the decision should be made on credible evidence in the record. And the record in this case clearly supports a negative value. X factors and revenue cap indexes are commonly based on statistical research that uses historical data on utility operations. Many of the utilities in these studies operate under cost of service regulation. A consumer dividend is then added to the formula to share with customers the benefit of accelerated productivity growth that is expected during the plan. That's how it's usually done. The consumer advocate faults Dr. Lowry for making adjustments to the data and doing his analyses, even though he made the adjustments to make the data more relevant to Hawaii. The Blue Planet technology apparently does not suffer from this so-called flaw. What the consumer advocate does not tell you is that Mr. Benz's results yield a more negative X factor before his MPIR adjustment than does Mark Lowry's analysis. Mr. Benz's average results for his 15-year study period is minus 2.07% before his MPIR adjustment. His aggregate result for his 15-year study period is minus 1.66% before his MPIR adjustment. These are taken from Blue Planet slide 8. With respect to the MPIR, will we open the floodgates for MPIR applications by adding resilience as an eligible project category, as some of the parties fear? Our response is that we will not. The company must obtain approval in accordance with the MPIR guidelines to recover project costs through the MPIR adjustment mechanism. The MPIR guidelines have a separate set of requirements, including the submission of a detailed business case study that should cover all aspects of the planned investments and activities and reasonably document and quantify the cost-benefit characteristics of the investments and activities. This is not a simple task. With respect to review triggers, and we're as guilty of this as others, having a provision that opens up the PBR framework for review and modification after a downgrade occurs, it's a lot like locking the barn door after the horses have bolted. Credit ratings will not quickly be restored once downgraded. That process can take years. We need to proactively set up the framework in a way that helps us maintain and improve our current credit ratings. Going back briefly to the MPIR process, the sense I got from the questions we were asked yesterday was that the Commission may be concerned about approving the proposed X factor since the scenarios supporting the X factor and MPIR include additional projects, and the Commission hasn't reviewed the support for that. One possibility is to take out the additional project costs, receive explicit authority to ask for these types of incremental project costs to the MPIR. The Commission could review the business case for the expenditures and reduce the proposed X factor. The appropriate X factor reduction could be calculated as we did for the MPIR change in the response to the PUC party's IR 04. We'll look at that possibility in our closing brief. That is what happened in one of the recent Massachusetts MRP cases with respect to grid mod expenditures, and we can cite that case. With respect to the implementation process, more process and rigorous reviews during the control period can diminish a central simplification benefit of having a longer control period. So we urge the Commission to carefully review the proposed processes and reporting requirements. Yesterday, Ulupono, make sure I got this. Yesterday, Ulupono said there is nothing unique or magical about our business. I think we took that off the verbal transcript. That many other businesses are capital intensive. They have long-lived assets and union workforces, and they flourish without cost of service regulation. In fact, we are different. We are required to serve everyone while helping accomplish Hawaii's clean energy goals. Other capital-intensive businesses have the choice and option to sell products and services to those that are most profitable at a price they or the market set, and avoid customers or markets that might lose money. We can't and would never abandon this market. We can't sell to other markets. We don't set our own prices, and everyone depends on us as an essential service provider to all of our state. This is the commitment we make to our customers and communities. So finally, we support performance-based regulation. We have advocated for performance-based regulation in earlier proceedings. If properly designed, PBR will benefit customers, other service providers and stakeholders, and the companies. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in what has been a very meaningful and informative proceeding. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Alke. Thank you, Mr. Williams. Moving next to the consumer advocate is Mr. Nishina speaking.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed, Mr. Nishina.
Thank you. Chair Griffin, Commissioner Potter, Commissioner Asuncion, Commission staff, and other parties in the docket. I would like to express my appreciation to the commissioners and commission staff for the way they have overseen this proceeding. Without the Commission's hard work throughout this proceeding to deal with the challenge to further evolve Hawaii's electric industry regulatory process from traditional cost of service regulation, we would not be where we are today. The Commission's hard work to ensure progress in this proceeding and to have this hearing under the current pandemic conditions is a testament to the Commission's diligence. I would also like to thank Rocky Mountain Institute and the other parties for the hours and hours of work and collaborative discussions that preceded this hearing. The collaborative discussions enabled the consumer advocate to listen to other parties' ideas and possible proposals and learn from the other parties and Commission feedback. The consumer advocate appreciates being part of those discussions and the opportunity to engage with the Commission, RMI, and other parties on the issues. Those many hours of work and discussions allowed meaningful exchanges of ideas and feedback that led to the consumer advocate's recommendations. Through the progress of the workshops, the ISOPs, RSOPs, many filings, and in this hearing, it is apparent that there is general agreement that the regulatory processes for Hawaiian electric companies need to evolve just as the electric industry is evolving. There is also agreement as to some of the changes that should be made. This proceeding is evidence that all parties are striving to accelerate the transformation of Hawaii's energy systems from reliance upon expensive and dirty imported fossil fuels to efficient, affordable, and clean energy systems. We all support a regulatory structure that materially rewards the company's investors when the companies achieve operational efficiencies that benefit customers and demonstrate exemplary performance in pursuit of the regulatory outcomes. Hawaiian Electric recognizes the need for improving its cost management performance, as acknowledged in its comments responding to the Commission's management audit, and in the company's opening statement, Mr. Scott Siu also recognized the need for the Hawaiian Electric companies to achieve exemplary performance. The consumer advocate believes that it is through this proceeding that we will be able to clearly set the new regulatory path that highlights the connection between performance and rewards instead of profits associated with traditional capital bias that was indifferent to performance. It is key, however, that the design of the performance mechanisms carefully consider how to cost-effectively achieve the desired regulatory outcomes. The record before the Commission presents a clear choice in designing performance incentives. The consumer advocate's proposal is based upon the confidence that the clean energy future is the necessary and most affordable path for consumers. The consumer advocate has advanced the adoption of a multi-year rate plan to encourage the companies to quickly cost-effective TOTEX solutions so that the companies can retain overall achieved cost savings. The consumer advocate has bolstered the proposed multi-year rate plan with shared savings mechanisms directed towards rewarding the companies for successfully developing the required emergent skills. This structure rewards performance while putting downward pressure on TOTEX because the companies only earn the incentive when they deliver measurable savings to consumers. In this proceeding, the Commission has set forth framework proposals that should adhere to certain foundational principles, one of which is a customer-centric framework. The consumer advocate hopes that the Commission agrees that shared savings mechanisms are the clearest manner of establishing incentives that are consistent with that principle. With an SSM, as the companies realize and deliver the benefits from projects or programs, both the customers benefit and the companies increase their earnings. The consumer advocate notes that other parties have proposed PIMs instead of SSMs. For instance, the consumer advocate acknowledges the work that Ulupono has performed and its innovative RPS-AA PIM and supporting analyses. As discussed in response to Chair's questions during the hearing, the consumer advocate believes that since prices for recent renewable energy resources have been cost competitive, the Commission should consider whether the RPS-A or any other similar PIM under consideration can employ a design that would provide rewards based on delivered benefits and/or savings. The consumer advocate acknowledges that there are certain outcomes that will not result in quantifiable benefits and an SSM may not be possible. The consumer advocate has concerns with PIMs that could result in bill increases as it seems that Hawaii has a real opportunity to not only reduce its reliance on fossil fuels, but also to deliver realizable savings. As highlighted by the County of Hawaii's presentation, there are customers on Hawaii Island that need rate and bill relief. This is also true for the other islands. The Commission should avoid allowing electricity rates to morph into a form of taxation that would further increase rates and potentially leave customers in an even worse position. Ulupono has offered an analysis that suggested that its proposal would result in lower customer bills than the status quo. The consumer advocate points out the obvious that using an SSM could result in an even lower price path while still allowing the companies to increase its profits. The consumer advocate urges the Commission not to ask consumers to monetize carbon at this time to fund an incentive when the shared savings proposed by the consumer advocate reward the companies for advancing renewable energy and the GHG reduction outcome without further burdening customers. At the end of a future control period, the Commission can review and the consumer advocate could potentially support paying the companies for carbon reduction through a PIM instead of an SSM in the out years when incremental achievement may be more difficult. Besides the concern with establishing PIMs that may result in customers compensating the companies for costs not directly related to electric service, the Commission should design any PIM or SSM to target exemplary performance. In certain instances, the companies have proposed possible rewards and targets that would not require performance improvement, let alone exemplary performance. Additionally, any PIM should be supported by a benefit cost analysis that demonstrates, at the very least, the incentive is not greater than the value delivered. The unavailability of data may inhibit the ability to establish exemplary targets for certain PIM or SSM, but the consumer advocate urges the Commission to not allow rewards for the status quo. If data needs to be collected, the Commission should allow for that collection of the data first and then establish meaningful targets that will deliver benefits to customers and promote exemplary performance in the desired outcomes. Similarly, with regards to metrics and scorecards, the consumer advocate continues to urge the Commission to establish metrics and scorecards to underscore the need for the companies to transparently measure their performance and to seek in that performance. The consumer advocate's proposed scorecards and metrics represent a reasonable portfolio that will both protect customers from the erosion of traditional regulatory outcomes and drive transformation beneficial to customers. The consumer advocate acknowledges that duplicative metrics should not be established, but offers that if the collection of data is cumbersome and manual, then perhaps the companies have not given adequate attention to the importance of the metric. The data collected for the metric should be easily retrievable and accessible, and the resource available to the company staff and stakeholders on a regular basis. With respect to revenue adjustment mechanisms, we should consider what we have now: an MRP that is reasonably balanced, yielding adequate but not excessive returns to the utilities. Considerable effort has been invested in developing, refining, and administering a full complement of existing revenue adjustment mechanisms that have been tailored to meet our needs and include the following: escalation via capped RAM that accounts for inflation while incenting strong cost control; full revenue decoupling via an RBA tariff that insulates the utilities from all risk of sales volatility by assuring full recovery of approved target revenues; comprehensive ECRC and PPAC mechanisms that assure recovery of the largest and most volatile of utility costs; targeted additional revenue increases for recovery of extraordinary investments and expenses that support the Commission's goals via the MPIR and REIP mechanisms; a symmetrical earnings sharing mechanism; a provision for exogenous changes within the existing RAM; and administrative processes to coordinate filings, review, and approval of rate changes for all of these mechanisms, along with Commission-approved performance incentives. The consumer advocate is recommending transformational and evolutionary changes that will break the link identified in Act 5 and agrees with the Commission's Phase 1 principles outlined in DNO 36326, requiring a customer-centric approach to the new PBR framework and day one savings for customers, simplifying the regulatory framework to achieve administrative efficiency, all while maintaining utility financial integrity. To answer one of Commissioner Potter's questions, our recommendations comply with all of these principles and would support innovative transformational actions. As detailed in the Consumer Advocate's filed materials and heard through these hearings, many of the company's recommendations do not satisfy these principles. The companies propose negative productivity factors and more permissive MPR mechanism that would raise customer rates faster in the future. This is not customer-centric and does not encourage cost control and provides no savings for customers. The companies offer only a diluted and delayed customer dividend, only gradually recognizes committed management audit savings owed to customers, while keeping for shareholders all of the benefits of accelerating ARA adjustments to January 1st. This is not customer-centric and provides no day one benefits. The companies propose COCAM, off-ramps, expansive Z-factor opportunities, and a right to traditional rate case whenever they deem it reasonable. This is not customer-centric and is potentially costly to customers and is incompatible with affordability and administrative efficiency outcomes. Rather than embracing the commitment to improve cost control that should improve financial performance and to develop new revenue streams that would possibly support better credit ratings, the companies instead suggest liberalization of each of the most important revenue adjustment mechanisms at ratepayers' expense. The company's proposals seek future revenues and earnings increases with no benefits for ratepayers flowing from these proposals. Regarding Commissioner Potter's questions on the costs and benefits of higher ratings, those benefits will be passed through to customers only if we retain cost of service regulation. Otherwise, the shareholders will reap those benefits. While improving credit ratings should be a byproduct of the framework, targeting specific ratings at consumers' expense is not reasonable. DNO 36326 also outlined a series of goals and outcomes, all of which are best satisfied with the Consumer Advocate's Phase 2 Revenue Adjustment Mechanism recommendations. The Consumer Advocate's proposals are aligned and compatible with the traditional desired outcomes, such as affordability, cost control, capital formation, and customer equity. Our ARA proposal encourages cost control for all business as usual functions of the utility by limiting automatic annual revenue increases to a general measure of inflation, which also meets the affordability goal. Then, for extraordinary project investments and expenses, the MPIR and REIP will continue to provide additional revenues only when needed and justified, subject to submission of a business case and approval. In this way, the MPIR and REIP relax the cost control and affordability priorities to recognize special needs supporting interconnection, customer engagement, and other transformational projects that are aligned with PBR outcomes. The X factor input to the ARA is perhaps the most contentious revenue adjustment mechanism issue to be resolved. The companies have filed hundreds of pages of PEG studies in the record, but still seem unsettled around questions such as what historical averaging period to rely upon, whether and how to eliminate overlaps with the MPIR, and what to make of so-called inflation differentials. Consumer Advocates RSOP addresses many of the significant problems and omissions within the PEG studies. Other X-factor analyses relied on a similar mainland utility historical trend perspective, but arrived at much different results than PEG, in part by recognizing the overlap of certain recovery mechanisms. To find support for any negative value for the X in this docket, an analysis must rely on unacceptable assumptions such as depend on competing and unproven theories about how historical trend data from mainland utilities may be predictive of future cost trends expected for the companies. Ignore or crudely adjust for the problems of ARA, MPIR, and REIP overlapping recovery, and select from a menu of arbitrary averaging periods and data aggregation methods and accept subjective adjustments and calculation methods. Ulupono has succinctly pointed out that a negative productivity factor would be a perpetuation of cost of service regulation. The Commission should reject all negative X factor recommendations because history does not predict the future. Mainland utilities are not comparable with HECO. TA's short-term model demonstrated that the companies do not need a negative X. The Z factor input is another place where the companies want more recovery opportunity for an extensive new list of potential future risks and costs. The company had several events and costs as eligible for Z factor filings and recoveries. The Consumer Advocate urges the Commission to reject this expansive laundry list of vaguely defined new cost categories that are likely to invite contentious future proceedings over the need for exogenous recovery of such costs, since existing base rates already provide recovery of significant ongoing costs. We should instead retain a narrowly prescribed Z-factor eligibility approach that has worked well historically and complies with the desired outcomes of cost control, affordability, and administrative efficiency. Another MRP issue of great importance is the future role of the MPIR. The Commission got it right in DNO 36328, where it indicated continuation of the MPIR is appropriate for only what it called exceptional projects. However, the company seek expansion of MPIR eligibility for a multitude of new types of activities and costs that are business as usual. These expansion proposals related to software development, preliminary engineering costs, and other types of costs that are already embedded within base rates. And these costs will be escalated by GDPPI instead of allowing for MPIR incremental revenues. It would be nearly impossible in an MPIR review proceeding to verify changes in all levels of comparable activity and costs in a timely fashion. The Consumer Advocate urges the Commission to not add new, vaguely defined, and potentially controversial MPIR eligibility terms and instead adopt the Consumer Advocate's proposal. The Consumer Advocate continues to support a one-time customer dividend in the form of a bill credit quantified to advance to customers the value of ARA acceleration. Our recommendation provides a significant and noticeable day one benefit to customers. It has the advantage of being earnings neutral to the companies by the end of the control period, while creating no drag upon future revenues and earnings after the dividend is ordered and accrued on the books. In the interest of affordability, cost control, and administrative efficiency, the Consumer Advocate opposes the insertion of MRP off-ramps, the adoption of single-issue rate-making for cost of capital in the form of a COCAM, and any reversion to cost of service rate cases at the end of the control period. The Commission has rightfully emphasized translating the important work of this docket into an implementable order. The Consumer Advocate proposes that the Commission issue an order implementing its framework and direct the parties to collaborate throughout the control period and, where applicable, in other dockets to develop refinements in the incentive portfolio as needed. We have proposed a framework of annual filing dates and review procedures to administer the MRP mechanisms, and we have also proposed a process to review the performance mechanisms to evaluate whether they are adequately and cost-effectively aligning companies' interests with regulatory outcomes. The proposed flexibility should allow the evaluation and redesign of framework elements and should focus on balancing the two goals of providing utilities with the regulatory certainty to make financial decisions that may result in long-term commitments, whether it is a long-term service agreement or a capital investment, and modifying the PIM or SSM over time to adjust to changing circumstances and lessons learned. We look forward to the direction by the Commission and collaboration with the utilities and other parties to address the detailed implementation of the Commission's revenue and performance mechanism findings. The Commission has an opportunity to send another postcard from the future, and the consumer advocate contends that a much more compelling message would be how the adopted resulted in the acceleration of Hawaii's renewable energy adoption, but also delivered it at affordable and hopefully lower rates. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to participate in this proceeding and to offer the consumer advocate's proposal for the Commission's consideration. Thank you, and this completes our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Nishina. Next up is City and County of Honolulu. Mr. Molden.
Are we skipping over Blue Planet?
Oh,
Hello.
I'm sorry.
Hi.
You're right. You're right. No, you're sorry. I jumped ahead. Sorry, Isaac.
I'm confident it wasn't Freudian.
No.
So it's going to be
you
1,
weren't
2.
here earlier, so I was just.
Yeah, no problem. It's going to be 1, 2 again, Ron and me. But thank you, everybody. Chair Griffin, Commissioners Potter and Asuncion, Commission staff, consultants, and all the parties. It's been a long 2.5 years. When Rod was reciting all the steps, I didn't know whether to cheer or to groan, but anyway, almost POW. And actually, it's been 6.5 years, going back to the inclinations that originally opened up this path. How to sum it all up? At this point, really, there's not much that hasn't already been said and heard. I do want to briefly highlight the key priority focuses for Blue Planet, and then let Mr. Binns have the final word because he's been with us on this journey for the whole time. So Commissioner Potter asked a fundamental question on day 1 of this hearing. Is PBR as innovative or transformative as we thought or hoped coming in? And that's the key question summing up this docket. How transformative will it be? The upcoming order from the Commission will be the most comprehensive and consequential statement on utility incentives and regulatory reform since the inclination 6.5 years ago. The Commission led the way then, and Blue Planet is again looking to the Commission's lead now in completing this circle and making the most of this historic opportunity to realize the Commission's transformative reform vision. As far as Blue Planet's take on that question of how transformative, well, it's clear that we're not going to have the platform utility of the future right out of the gate here. But we do want to make the most of this historic opportunity and focus most critically on the structure of regulation and the trajectory of change, especially over time. Not just the change in dollar costs, although that's very critical and long overdue, but more fundamentally, a change in the business and regulatory culture. Basically, what we're envisioning is the opposite of keeping cost of service regulation and just layering PIMs on the top. Yes, Mr. Binns has spent a ton of time and effort on independent analysis of the X factor, basically showing that HECO has double counted the revenues in the X factor by ignoring the effect of MPIR revenues. But this is not about pushing for the opposite of streams in the X factor and then just slapping a cost of service based earning sharing mechanisms over all of it. More than that, we want to highlight our 4 main priorities for that structural trajectory of change level. 1, provide a reopener clause instead of an earning sharing mechanism. Make it discretionary, not an autopilot pass-through mechanism of 100 or even 90 or 80% to customers, which is basically an 80, 90, or 100% reversion to cost of service regulation. We can follow the example of the Alberta Commission. Thanks to the Commission for introducing us to Commissioner Colasar. The Alberta Commission back in 2012 was leading the way in providing for a reopener clause available upon showing, quote, sufficient evidence that there is a problem that cannot be resolved through another avenue available under the plan. They indicated ROE was only one of many potential factors to consider, citing as a guide plus or minus 500 basis points in 1 year or plus or minus 300 basis points in consecutive years. Now, Blue Planet has offered a hierarchy of basically how transformative can we go on this issue. At the very least, if we adopt an ESM, include a wide deadband, no narrower than what HECO has already experienced under cost of service regulation, and recognizing, especially since we're going to be giving broader earnings opportunities on the upside and earnings opportunities through performance incentive mechanisms. Don't adopt yet another automatic cost of service regulation pass-through tracker in the earnings sharing mechanism. Number two, full discretion on the Commission on how to proceed at the end of the MRP. Again, we heard from Commissioner Colasar that the Alberta Commission didn't tip its hand on how it was going to proceed. Certainly, the Commission can do a rate case if necessary, but make sure the utility can't bank on it, which defeats all the incentives under PBR. Number three, MPIR. I'd say the most key is to add application requirements and evaluation criteria to MPIR, so it doesn't serve simply as a mini off-ramp back to cost of service regulation, but rather aligns with PBR principles and requires major project applications to basically incorporate a mini PBR plan for cost control and incentives. Essentially, we're talking about linking MPIR with performance. And number four, a portfolio of incentives addressing head-on the costs and burdens of fossil fuel reliance in line with the Commission's legal mandate under HRS 269-6B. As the Commission has acknowledged, the 2% ECRC sharing was just an initial step, and the Commission intended to follow up to establish, and I quote, incentives for exemplary performance by the companies to reduce fossil fuel generation, unquote. Now's the time to follow through with one or more PIMs directly addressing this overriding imperative to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've been talking about this literally for more than 6 years, and we don't have another 6 years to get this done. On DER-related PIMs, we're open to an interim approach to adopting PIMs, but as we've seen in the DER context specifically, interim can turn into a very long time. And so we're not looking for perfect PIMs. We're looking for productive PIMs that don't validate the status quo with an express recognition that additional PIMs are coming. So that's our 4 key recommendations to round out this extensive process and make Hawaii's PBR framework as transformative as it can be. Reopener, not an ESM, discretion at the end of the MRP, link MPIR with PBR, and a portfolio of incentives to reduce fossil fuel use, cost, and reliance. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ron Binns to share his insights and experience as a former regulator who really has been engaged in this PBR conversation and journey with us for the entire duration. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Commissioners, in 2018, the Commission and a group of people and organizations embarked on a journey to invent and establish a new kind of incentive regulation in Hawaii. While it was important to know what others had done, this group determined to find a solution that meets Hawaii's special circumstances and builds on the existing progress and tradition. Blue Planet is pleased to have been part of that effort, and we hope that our contributions were helpful. What's going on in Hawaii has become a topic of many meetings across the U.S., and with scores of utilities, hundreds of energy advocates, and virtually all utility regulators in the country. They are, if not on the edge of their seats, at least very interested to know what the Hawaii Commission does. Commissioners, I'm reminded of a nation turns its lonely eyes to you. As you move forward to your decision, I hope you keep these expectations of others in mind, not to add pressure, but to remind yourselves of the influence this decision will have in many other places. The Hawaii PUC has the opportunity to lead not only in this state, but across the country. Blue Planet understands that Wall Street is watching too. And you, commissioners, are in the familiar dance that I knew as a commissioner, wanting to be inventive, to move Hawaii in the right direction, and to lead, even if those influential analysts don't fully see what you see. Those institutions are fundamentally conservative because it's their job to be. And as you've probably discovered, the best way to deal with those analysts is with consistency and lots of communications. At least as important as the metrics are to them is the sense that they are dealing with a thoughtful, balanced, and predictable regulatory agency that has explicitly considered the needs of the regulated companies. You can demonstrate that by defending any new or unfamiliar piece of your decision with consistent explanations that harken back to your main goal, improving the incentives faced by Hawaii's utilities and equipping those companies to help us all move to a clean energy future. In our statements over the past 2 days and in Isaac's statement just now, Blue Planet has often cited the earnings sharing mechanism as the most problematic aspect of the case being argued before the Commission. It has the obvious appeal and it has strong ties back to current practice. It's pretty much like a comfort blanket. But in Blue Planet's view, it is preventing this model from being transformative. Most agree that the ESM will dull the incentives that were intentionally created by using a longer control period. The ESM also weds this regulation to cost of service in a way that is at odds with the theory and practice between the RPI minus X approach to revenue controls. This is especially true in this case because the ESM will be deployed every year during the 5-year control period. That means that the 5-year control period resolves into a series of 1-year check-ins and possible adjustments. With this financial and psychological leash of the ESM, you can be assured that the utility will not stray very far. But that's the problem. As a former commissioner, I tend to think in terms of what your final order might read. And in the famous words of the satirist Tom Lehrer, I have a modest example here. Please put yourselves in the role of a Wall Street analyst as you read these 2 paragraphs. Quote, after much consideration, we have determined not to include an earnings sharing mechanism in the final PBR structure. This is a change from our Phase 1 order. We are concerned that an ESM dulls the incentives we hope for regulation to provide and sends the wrong signal to the utilities. We hope that the HECO companies use their new flexibility to improve operations, provide better service, innovate, and increase their earnings without being impeded by the ESM. We want the companies to be able to analyze the effects of their choices over the entire 5-year control period, uninterrupted by annual earnings checks. And we do not want to limit the upside earnings that might come from successful performance on the PIMs. But no one should mistake our intention. We remain strongly committed to having a financially healthy utilities in Hawaii. Poor financial performance is not an option for a utility that is making an honest effort to succeed under our PBR regime. If we find that the PBR regime is not producing the intended results for whatever reason, we will interrupt the regime without delay and deal with any shortcomings. I contend that that would be comforting to Wall Street analysts and would set you off on a course for making this PBR as PB as possible. I hadn't planned to respond to others in this statement, but I think Tom Williams misused my X factor analysis in his closing comments. My so-called MPIR adjustment is an essential part of my analysis, not an after-the-fact addition. It is an adjustment that Dr. Lowry should have made. To clarify, our recommendation for the combined X factor and consumer dividend is within the range of 0% to minus 0.6%, and misinterpreting my analysis doesn't change that. In closing, Blue Planet thanks the Commission and its legal and technical staff for all you've done to make this docket a success. You should all be proud of each other. I should also mention our thanks to RMI for their guidance and facilitation during this process. We look forward to the Commission's order and to a great result. Aloha and mahalo.
Thank you, Mr. Moriwaki. Thank you, Mr. Binns. I apologize again. City and County of Honolulu. Now it's your turn.
Hi, this is Rocky Mold
Thank you.
for the City and County of Honolulu. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Griffin, commissioners, commission staff, and all parties, as well as YouTube viewers out there. This has been a really incredible proceeding to advance, really important goals for the state of Hawaii. The city appreciates and has appreciated the opportunity to participate in this groundbreaking proceeding. As we've noted throughout in prior filings and presentations, the city sees the equitable decarbonization of our energy, electrical, and transportation systems as a key pillar of Oahu's resilience strategy. And this has formed the basis of our positions, analysis, and proposals. It is why we pushed for a GHG reduction PIM as a broad overarching incentive that we felt would drive a variety of mutually beneficial outcomes identified by all parties in this proceeding. We understand the concerns raised about the feasibility of designing a GHG reduction PIM at this time. While we respectfully disagree and believe there is enough data available to design a viable PIM at this time, we believe that Ulupono's RPS-A PIM represents a viable alternative. And this could actually be complemented by a GHG reduction PIM as well, as demonstrated in Ulupono's analysis. In particular, it would be important, however, to complement an RPS-A PIM with a very robust GHG scorecard that includes metrics on monetary valuation, as well as mass-based and carbon and system intensity levels. Also, we would recommend that this be complemented by a robust LMI-focused set of customer engagement PIMs, as envisioned by some of the recent Commission IRs to parties. In addition, we support inclusion of Blue Planet Foundation's fuel use reduction PIM and SSM ideas, and we have recommended similar measures in our prior filings. We also understand the concerns about internalizing the external costs of carbon emissions, and in particular, how it may burden ratepayers. We respectfully disagree and believe that the benefits of investments in carbon reduction greatly outweigh the costs. And we note the high value of early and aggressive carbon reductions. GHG reduction, accelerated renewable portfolio standard attainment, and fuel use reduction achieve these needed and urgent goals. We also support an MPIR mechanism designed to cover exceptional investments aligned with key system transformation outcomes to increase the capacity of and modernize the grid, to bolster resilience, support electrification of transportation, and support frontline community and LMI targeted investments. These are key city priorities for us. We also spent a significant amount of time looking at the ARA and developing our recommendations for how to set the I factor X factor, and consumer dividend. We understand the need for the utility to have leeway to operate and invest throughout the control period. But we just would like to offer that this should also be balanced against customer interests. We believe there are enough details, there's enough analysis in the record for the Commission to make a wise judgment on how to set the ARA going forward. Finally, we'd like to note just how impressed we've been with all of the detailed analysis, art, the science, the knowledge, and the know-how that have gone into all the parties' presentations. There is significant evidentiary record for the Commission to use its discretion, its knowledge, its know-how to make the decision and to be the ultimate arbiter of how to balance ratepayer and all stakeholders' interests through a viable PBR framework. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit, it really laid bare many of our structural barriers to achieving our really important urgent goals. The city and county, had to reprioritize many of its assets. But what we realized through this process is that there really is an asymmetry of power. There is really, an inequitable distribution of income, of wealth, but also there's an inequitable distribution of power, of who has a seat at this table. And going forward and going forward and setting this PBR framework, we just want to make sure that the other voices are heard, that other voices are brought into this PBR process, are brought into the PBR framework that this Commission will be putting forth. So to end, I just want to say how appreciative we are of being part of this process and how important and urgent we believe that this process is, and transforming the utility to be better aligned with key public policy priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mold. Next is the DER parties. Mr. Harris, you speaking?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please proceed. Thanks.
Great, thank you. In preparing this closing statement, we reviewed, among other things, the goals and outcome briefs filed in August 2018. I'm impressed by how many of these concepts have been developed through the course of this proceeding. It is a testament to the Commission staff and stakeholders, such as Blue Planet and Ulupono, who fully engage in this process and see the importance of the end result. Reviewing the old filings was also an opportunity to review some of the big picture concepts. I believe everyone in this docket is aware that PBR is likely to be a carefully managed process, with the Commission setting specific goals and tinkering with measures as time goes by to ensure that the overarching end goals are achieved. To this end, the DER parties encourage the Commission to adopt a specific vision statement and indicate that the end goal is to create a new regulatory compact and business model under which utilities and non-utility energy service providers can earn fair compensation based on performance that is aligned with the public interest to drive innovation, engage customers, and deliver reliability, resilience, and economic efficiency. Why is this important? First, we have to recognize that most electric utilities, as a general observation, have not been regulated nor encouraged to be particularly innovative. It is unlikely the status quo is going to change overnight. It will require continuous engagement to ensure the type of cost control and innovation we want to see actually occurs. Second, we have to recognize the importance of Act 5 wasn't merely to drive rate reduction or advance clean energy, although both were critically important goals, but also recognize the fundamental transformation currently underway in how customers get electricity service. Customer expectations about the source of their energy, choice in energy providers, control over their energy bills, and cost-effective, reliable electricity services has evolved significantly in recent years. This evolution is a result of innovation in DERs, clean energy financing, and forward-thinking regulatory commissions, including this one. While customers continue to expect affordable and reliable electricity service, customers today also expect utility accountability, options to improve affordability and manage their electricity bills, and choices in the sources and from whom they receive energy services. Customers are unlikely to care about buzzwords like utility transformation, utility of the future, much less undecipherable acronyms we use frequently in this proceeding. They're going to be focused on how these changes impact them. While they will likely appreciate rate reductions, they will also focus on, will this make my bills more manageable, and how? Will this give me new choices in how to meet everyday requirements in their home, such as added resilience or choices of clean energy? Will this change how the utility does business with me and the way it exists in the community? Setting up clear end goal ensures that we keep circling back to these types of questions and hold that up as a measuring stick as we evaluate our success or failure. Finally, I'd like to underscore the need to realign the utility's interest in seeing a successful and vibrant DER market. While I can belabor the historical and recent challenges with interfacing with the Hawaiian Electric utilities, I'll simply observe that Hawaii has the highest deployment of customer-sited batteries per capita, and yet few, if any, of these customers are currently capable or allowed to provide grid services. Utilities like Green Mountain Power are years ahead of Hawaii, despite having a significantly smaller DER market. Change is necessary and critical if Hawaiian Electric is going to continue to be the electricity service provider in the future. Thank you for the opportunity to present today, and once again, thank you for engaging this critically important and challenging topic.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Now, Life of the Land, Mr. Curtis.
Aloha, Commission staff, parties, and YouTubers. Lifeline entered this proceeding mindful of the incredible amount of new information we would have to absorb and dissect. The docket did not disappoint us on this. The numerous staff reports and filings by the various parties provided a great deal of initial data to sift through. Life of the Land was and is pleased to see the collaborative approach led by the commissioners, the commission staff, and Rocky Mountain Institute. We wish to underscore that the commission has set the standard for web-based hearings. Life of the Land strongly believes that the Ulupono solution is a win-win-win for the utility, regulators, and ratepayers. Life of the Land agrees with HECO and with the consumer advocate that this isn't the time or place for a greenhouse gas PIM. Greenhouse gas emissions is a very significant and very critical externality. Life of the Land has addressed the greenhouse gas issue in numerous commission proceedings since 2001, filed a greenhouse gas complaint, and won 2 Hawaii Supreme Court decisions. Greenhouse gas PIMs require a deliberative, thoughtful, and collaborative approach with the establishment of reliable, holistic data, appropriate baselines, and effective incentive-based solutions. The parties advocating greenhouse gas PIMs in this proceeding are not in the dockets that are critically examining life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that include extraction, shipping, processing, refining, and silo-based emissions. One example is the Commission's regulatory review of the HECO PAR fuel supply contract, where cutting-edge greenhouse gas emission regulatory proceedings are being critically analyzed and developed. Life of the Land strongly agrees that performance-based regulation offers an opportunity for extraordinary transformation. There are at least 2 major dangers that we must be mindful of. One is strictly regulatory. The utility might earn excessive revenue without changing its policies or positions, or they might suffer very poor performance. Both actions could negatively impact ratepayers. The other is that the utility may seek shortcuts and pilot projects that earn them a higher rate of return with less regulation that may have very negative impacts for non-utility ecosystems, including community, fauna, and flora. It is mandatory that the utility takes serious its need to increase documentation, transparency, meaningful two-way communication, and provide more than de minimis notice that simply meets regulatory requirements. In conclusion, we give a very, very strong mahalo to the commission staff, and all of the participants in this proceeding. Mahalo.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Now Ulupono Initiative, Mr. Clay. Yes, great, bring up presentation. Please proceed when you're ready.
So commissioners, staff, and parties, once again, aloha. My name is Murray Clay. I'm the president of the Ulupono Initiative, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to address the group. Next slide, please. So this is what brought us here today in this 2.5-year journey, or as you go back as far as Mr. Moriwaki was mentioning, 6 or more years back. But we're brought here today really by the PBR legislation. And the vision behind that was to protect consumers by proactively ensuring that the existing utility business and regulatory model will be updated for the 21st century. I'd just like to take a second to point out that it's 2020 and we're 1/5 of the way through the 21st century. And so now is really the time to fix this, to get PBR in place. We've really been subject to cost of service regulation, as far as I've been able to determine, back to 1913 for over 100 years. So we now have a historic opportunity to fix some of the mistakes of the past, although I do note over the last 10 years there has been significant amounts of regulatory reform, which we appreciate. But now is the time to fix this. Now is the time for the Commission to issue a holistic, performance-based regulation and regime, and not something piecemeal, and not kick any portion of this as the can down the street, so to speak. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be interesting to go through that legislation briefly and just tie that out to the different components that we've been recommending. So reducing the cost of energy and operations goes to shared savings mechanisms, the multi-year rate plan, and the ARA indexed revenues. The curtailment of renewable generation, the accelerated retirement of utility-owned fossil fuel generation, and reducing investments in utility-owned fossil fuel generation all are addressed by the RPSA. Customer affordability is addressed by shared savings mechanisms, and because of lower cost renewables, also the RPSA. Electricity reliability is generally addressed through the existing reliability PIMs. Customer engagement and satisfaction has to do with existing PIMs like the call center PIM, electrification of transportation, and RPSA in terms of giving customers more choices to connect renewables and have EVs. Access to system information is addressed generally by the metrics and scorecards that have been proposed. Rapid interconnection of renewables and distributed resources is both the RPSA and EOT if you consider EVs essentially to be distributed batteries that could provide the grid services. And finally, the timely execution of competitive procurement and interconnection of third-party resources is addressed both by shared savings mechanisms and the incentive to rapidly increase renewables as given in the RPSA. Next slide, please. So we've said this a few times, so I'll just repeat it once more briefly, that we really think we should be focused on getting to the 100% renewable energy future we want to arrive at by the least cost path possible. We get the incentives right, we shouldn't care who owns it that much, and we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. Regardless of whatever technology utility program is the best solution to a problem and the lowest cost solution, that's what we should be going after. Again, not picking the winners and losers in this. Next slide, please. So I made this point also yesterday, but what we have with cost of service regulation is a fundamental misalignment of interests. With cost of service regulation, the utility has a clear incentive to build things and increase rate base. And I would say if we give a for-profit company the wrong incentives, it's not shame on them for pursuing them, it's actually shame on us. So we now have the opportunity to correct that mistake, to align incentives so that the shareholders' interests do align with the ratepayers' interests. And if we do that, as I've said, we think the best of both worlds is possible, in which the utility can flourish financially, and ratepayers can actually see lower rates. Those are not in opposition to each other. We think we can do both. Next slide, please. So we think the way that we align those interests is with a robust portfolio of PIMs that address the regulatory outcomes that we want to see. We believe the RPSA, the EOT PIM, and the portfolio of shared savings mechanisms do that. I'm not going to rehearse the ARA formula that we're all familiar with once again, but I want to make the point that I made yesterday one last time, which is that as a finance guy and a bit of a quant nerd, I actually do very much appreciate the quantitative rigor that went into Pacific Economics Group, X Factor, and especially the work that Mr. Bintz did to take major projects out of those X Factor calculations. We're still left with a calculation that is a sophisticated answer for what is the average above inflationary rate increases that come due to the inefficiencies and capital bias in the cost of service regulatory model. So we still believe very strongly, despite all the very impressive math, that if we adopt a negative X factor, we are saying, let's borrow the average inefficiencies from cost of service regulation, put that inside PBR, and just throw PIMs on top. And we still strongly believe that's a mistake. Next slide, please. So briefly, to go through our 3 PIMs at a high level. The RPSA certainly focuses on carbon reduction, reducing exposure to volatile oil prices, and it does provide resiliency benefits. It only pays out about 10% of the total benefit in terms of an incentive to the utility. And if you look at our entire forecast out to 2045, the maximum value this reaches is 1.6% of ROE. For electrification of transportation, this is a way to address an even greater source of greenhouse gas emissions, ground transportation, than is created by the entire electric sector. So we want the utility to be a strong partner in this, and it will put downward pressure on rates because those those fixed costs are being spread over more kilowatt hours through decoupling, and that benefits every single ratepayer, whether they own an EV or not. There's also grid supportive services involved. We're looking at paying out 10 to 25% of the total benefit, and the modeling shows that this tops out just under a half percentage point of ROE. For shared savings mechanisms, they're applicable, we think, to a wide variety of competitive procurements, including grid services and non-wires alternatives. We've proposed a slight innovation, mostly for administrative efficiency, to focus on actual performance and pay those rewards out as you go, rather than forecasting performance, paying it in advance, and then having to true up for poor performance later. We are looking at paying out about 30% of savings through shared savings mechanisms, and that tops out just under about 0.25% of ROE. Next slide, please. So you've all seen this before. This is from our risk financial model and informed by the switch work for the resource plan that Dr. Fripp did. And you can see that the rewards do start off relatively modest, but there is an opportunity to grow them over time to make them a significant contribution to the utility's financial performance. Next slide, please. So you've seen this slide before, but I think it's worth repeating. The PIMs that we proposed do address 7 of the 12 identified regulatory outcomes. They are fully aligned with existing statutory precedent and local level policy commitments, including the RPS, explicit authorization to provide incentives for accelerating the RPS, and the county's electrification and transportation commitments. The amount of money we're talking about is significant enough to drive the utility's performance and attention at a 2% ROE opportunity. These are very administratively simple PIMs. The math is basic arithmetic, the metrics are clear, this is very easy to do. And those numbers are also very objective and easy to be measured. We would argue that our PIMs are some of the only PIMs, honestly, including some of the shared savings mechanisms that have been proposed, the only PIMs out there that are really fully formed. They're fully articulated, fully modeled with transparent modeling, and they're ready to be employed January 2021. We do believe they will incentivize the grid of the future. We believe they're immune from gaming because, again, we're focused on rewards for results, not tallies of activity, and not forecasts. Next slide, please. Click again, please. I think we're missing something. Oh, sorry, go back. I guess we're missing. So apparently somehow the graphic, go back. I'll just talk through it anyway. Stay there. I'm not sure why, but this was the benefit cost analysis that we did for the RPSA. And that first arrow was pointing to the greenhouse gas valuation that took place in that benefit cost analysis. You can't see your numbers, but the point remains that as many people have quoted, there's Supreme Court rulings out there to focus the commission more on qualitative and quantitative analysis of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is a central part of the BCA analysis for both the RPSA and the EOT PIM. So we think that we're helpful in that way. We do know that customers care about the volatility of their bills. They want less risk and more fixed price bills, which is benefited and valued in the RPSA. And those resiliency benefits we feel are real. The ports, we've been lucky so far, but the ports are more subject to damage from hurricanes, tsunamis, and even geopolitical events than are renewable assets that are generally located farther inland. Next slide, please. Okay, I won't belabor this. Several parties today, Blue Planet and a few others, have quoted both Supreme Court rulings. They've quoted 269-6 and 269-94. We're just trying to make the point that the RPSA and the benefit cost analysis that supports it, I think, is just very helpful to the commission in addressing existing legislative and judicial mandates. So we view this as just being helpful to the commission. Next slide, please. So it looks like we have the same problem here. This was, again, the benefit cost analysis, this time for the electrification of transportation PIM. The first two columns, as those with good memories might recall, was looking at the increase, the slight increase in emissions from charging versus the much, much larger decrease in emissions from avoiding burning gasoline. And again, that's a much bigger source of greenhouse gas emissions than the entire electric sector is, so we care very much about that. We've also made the point through financial modeling work and did quite a bit on this topic to, I think, prove that there is a lot of fixed cost coverage in the amount of kilowatt hours that will be going to electric vehicles. So they are helping to bear the fixed cost load for everybody. And I think it's important to make that point that, again, even though EVs are only at 1% penetration presently, EOT PIM and the electrification of transportation indeed beyond environmental benefits, bill benefits alone affects all ratepayers in a positive way. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly. I think we're jumping around a little bit here. So I'll keep talking even if the slides bounce around on me. So for the MPR guidelines, we talked about this a lot. It's kind of a necessary evil. We do recognize it's important and it needs to be done properly. If it's not done properly, there is a very large risk of double recovery through both base rates for any kind of replacement CapEx and through MPIR. So we really want to focus on the eligible project list, not baseline plant additions and routine replacements. We're very comfortable with grid services and non-wires alternatives being in there. We think, as a matter of simple fairness, new service areas need to at least be considered for inclusion. We had some reluctant acceptance of new thermal generation under MPIR. If it's in line with state energy goals, it can be shown that it will not become a stranded asset. And we are comfortable with having shared savings mechanisms for MPIR, especially for MPIR that are part of competitive procurements, because we're more certain that we got a fair price. Z factor, I won't rehearse. We've all kind of gone over this several times, but I would say that we've recommended, and we haven't made a big deal about this because it's a very small innovation. We've recommended that both the MPIR thresholds and the Z factor thresholds both be increased annually by the ARA. We're talking about 5-year, multi-year rate plans, and over just 1 or 2 5-year periods, the real value of those goes down significantly. So it just seems prudent to increase them by the ARA, and that seems aligned with the intent of what the ARA is supposed to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's important to note that we're recommending an aggressive portfolio of PIMs. We want to strongly incentivize the utility. We're recommending a 0x, and so there is some pressure on the utility there, but we're not doing this recklessly. We're not just, throwing caution to the wind and in the interest of being innovative and transformative, just go for it and, let the casualties mount if they do. We're not taking that attitude. There's a lot of risk mitigation measures in this. We've often compared the earnings sharing mechanism to a guardrail to incentivize better performance within the deadband, but really prevent those extreme financial outcomes that could create such a bad situation that we have pressure to go back to cost of service regulation. I would point out that Ulupono does respect Blue Planet's position on their desire to not have an earnings sharing mechanism, but I would suggest that that guardrail analogy is a good one. We could take away guardrails from twisting mountain roads, and that might actually improve driver performance, but you're also going to have more casualties and more wrecks to clean up at the bottom of the cliff. And we would suggest that the earning and sharing mechanism be there at least for the first MRP and maybe even the second one. But if we have very good results, if things go well, I actually share Blue Planet's vision that someday, after we've got the experience of doing at least one MRP of performance-based regulation, that if things go well, there might be some future possibility to remove that. So our position on the ESM, we think, hasn't changed. It's still the same earning sharing mechanism as proposed by the consumer advocate. But if things go well, there is always the potential to remove that in future MRPs. We've proposed a PBR review process that tries to avoid over-frequent adjustments. And Blue Planet did raise the idea of reopeners being a way to address adjustments to PBR, and that's true. But there will always be a pressure to raise the bar on the utility when they do well, or lower the bar from the utility's perspective when they have bad returns. And if we don't have some resistance to over-frequent adjustments of the PBR regime, we can have PBR review put us back in cost of service regulation as well. We believe a good analogy for the Z factor is to shield the utility from extreme events that are unexpected and uncontrollable, and MPIR provides that necessary relief valve back to cost of service regulation for those truly transformative and not business as usual projects. Next slide, please. So we have done an enormous amount of work throughout this proceeding to try to provide to the parties fair and transparent financial modeling. We had that workshop back in November of 2019, and since then, every version of the RIST financial model has been shared with the parties. We've shared every version of Dr. Fripp's updated resource plans to try to inform the process and give everyone the ability to kind of check out the financial modeling for themselves. Based on the modeling outputs that we've had most recently, including the responses to the Commission's IR to the parties 5C that we discussed yesterday, we really do believe the modeling shows that proper incentives can yield better plans, and those better plans will yield better performance if followed. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, but I'll pause on the last one because we did just look at these yesterday. But I do admit that in the short term, the savings are relatively modest, but they are savings. You see a slightly lower total revenue amount on the reply statement of position. In other words, Ulupono's PBR structure with a PBR-inspired resource plan on the right-hand side, as opposed to status quo regulation with the HECO plan, which we view as a pre-PBR or a status quo resource plan on the left. Next slide, please. And yet at the same time, we see significantly higher returns for the utility, both higher than historical and higher than would occur under status quo regulation with the HECO plan. Next slide, please. So this is the one I want to pause on for a little bit. We talked about this a fair amount yesterday, so it's not just that I want to kind of focus everyone's attention again, but we really do believe this is possible. We believe that that better plan that is incentivized by RPSA, EOT, and other PIMs will yield better outcomes. And we see in this depiction that we're expecting almost a full percentage point lower compounded annual growth rate for ratepayers through PBR. And I would say that late yesterday, I believe it was Mr. Viola that mentioned that he thought our resource plan was a little bit optimistic and that we're running out of space for renewables. So I do just want to say quickly that there are significant differences well documented in our Exhibit D5 between their resource plan and ours. I would argue that the differences show that the HECO plan is unduly pessimistic towards renewables versus ours. Just a very few quick examples, again, all documented in Exhibit D5. The HECO plan assumes that DERs will remain flat for the first 3 years. We have DERs growing. They've manually added 604 megawatts of new combined cycle capacity, which was rejected by the Resolve Optimizer in the 2026 to 2032 timeframe. They manually removed 265 megawatts of offshore wind that was selected by Resolve, and they've manually removed all onshore wind that wasn't already in the pipeline. And finally, the HECO ISOP Exhibit P2, which quotes an NREL study, filters out all but the sunniest 35% of sites in Hawaii, and they also filter out all land parcels smaller than 1 square kilometer, which would imply a minimum solar project size of 33 to 38 megawatts. And most of the projects we have on Oahu today are already smaller than that, so they're filtering out things we already are doing. So I would say that as a whole, While we do know that the companies are certainly capable of doing great financial modeling, that's not represented in the HECO plan, and it is unduly pessimistic. So these savings that we're showing, we do believe are achievable and not optimistic. Next slide, please. So we do believe, in closing, that we're talking about a real potential for less cost for ratepayers, more ROE for the utility, and more renewable energy for everyone. The financial modeling supports it. We do believe this is a real opportunity, and we hope the commission will take it. Thank you. You can go to the next slide. It just says mahalo, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clay. That brings our closing statements to conclusion. Just a few matters to talk about and reminders to the party. The post-hearing briefings shall be due in 3 weeks after the parties receive access to the recording of the hearing. The hearing recording link will be provided by letter in the docket after the hearing's adjourned. I think I can say you should receive this shortly. For those of you that have looked, sure you've seen. Our recordings are up. We just want to verify everything, and then we'll send our letter. It'll be coming shortly. So just so everyone's keyed in on that, because it does trigger the timeline for the post-hearing submissions. Post-hearing briefing is limited to 30 pages, excluding exhibits. Information on how to cite to the hearing recording and the briefs was provided in the pre-hearing conference order. With that brings our time here to a close. I want to thank everyone again. It's been extraordinary. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks.